Picture this. You're playing Final Fantasy VI and you arrive in Narsh. In that town, nobody seems to be able to stop talking about Moogles. You know, these little creatures. This guy talks about Moogles. And this guy talks about Moogles. This guy is going on about a Sasquatch who, you guessed it, lives with the Moogles. You begin to suspect that either the writers have lost their minds, or else they're trying very hard to drop a hint about something you should do. The truth is that these non-player characters, or NPCs for short, are trying to tell you about a side quest to acquire the optional character Mog, who is, coincidentally, a Moogle. It's an easy quest to miss, because unless you're using a walkthrough, the way you find out about it is by talking to the townsfolk of Narsh at a certain point in the game. This happens a lot in Final Fantasy VI, and in Japanese RPGs generally. For example, this NPC in the second half of the game drops a hint that leads to the optional character Gogo. The designer never comes right out and tells you, hey, there's a quest here, because that might break the narrative spell of the game. Instead, the designer gives the player information in a totally in-character way. This in-character hint is what I call an allusion, and it's one of 5 different ways that NPCs can communicate. Every NPC in a video game has a purpose, and we can understand a lot about the design philosophy of those games by studying the NPCs in them. This video is going to look at the 5 primary ways that designers use NPC dialogue in RPGs to communicate with the player and enrich the worlds they're trying to build. I'm Patrick Holloman of the Game Design Forum, and these are the Game Design Extracts. Not counting jokes or meme content, there are 5 types of NPC speech: direction, allusion, condition, elaboration, and reaction. And these 5 types fall into 2 groups: ironic communication and narrative communication. We're going to look at the ironic categories first. People have a lot of misconceptions about what irony means. I could explain it, but I think Bender would probably do a better job.
The use of words expressing something other than their literal intention. Now that is irony.
That idea of saying one thing and meaning something else is really important for NPC speech. Video game designers have to communicate a lot of information to the player, and often NPCs are the vehicle for that information. But NPCs are also important for making the world of the game feel persuasive. If every NPC talks like a page out of the game's manual, the player won't be able to lose themselves in the story and the world of the game. Game designers know this, and so when they have to give the player important information, they often do it by speaking ironically through their NPCs. For example, this NPC in Chrono Trigger explains that an upcoming boss's best attack can be cancelled if the player uses Chrono's slash ability. He doesn't actually come right out and say, "Hey Chrono, use your slash attack on the upcoming boss." That would be like slapping the player's face and shouting, "Hey, you're playing a video game." Instead, the NPC delivers that information in a way that makes sense for the world of the game. The relevant game design information is transmitted through a thin veil of irony. With that in mind, let's take a look at a few of the ways that designers communicate ironically through NPCs. Sometimes NPCs come right out and tell the player something clear and useful, but they still say it in a way that makes sense for their character. I call this category of NPC speech direction. This NPC in Final Fantasy V tells the player that local beasts are weak against ice. This villager in Chrono Trigger says the same thing about lightning and dinosaurs. Even though this is an example of the designer blatantly telling the player how to play the game, it doesn't ruin the narrative spell of the game because those NPCs should know those facts, and often they have good reasons for sharing that information with the player character. Most of my favorite examples of direction come from Final Fantasy VI. Take for example this character in Zen, who tells the player to equip new accessories. If you think about it, this makes complete sense. The world the NPC lives in has gotten more dangerous, and it would make sense for him to warn travelers about that. But it also makes sense that this NPC would tell the player characters to shop locally. Obviously, the designers didn't come up with some elaborate backstory for this random villager, but they didn't have to. Simply putting him near the accessory shop makes the whole exchange a little bit more believable. That said, there are occasions when the designers freely break the narrative spell of the game to give the player directions. In the first town in Final Fantasies V, VI, and VII, as well as in Chrono Trigger, there is a special instructional house in which the designer communicates unironically with the player. But this is usually contained within a single building, and they come early enough in the game that the player still has plenty of time to become immersed in the world and fiction of the game. The next ironic category is what I call allusion. In this category, an NPC alludes to an important fact about the game, but leaves some important detail out. For example, this NPC in the second half of Final Fantasy VI tells the player about an optional quest at Doma Castle. He tells us what the player will encounter, demons, and where it will happen, Doma Castle. But he leaves out something important. In order to start that quest, Cyan must be in the party. That last little bit is what defines this as an allusion rather than a direction. But it also shows us why allusions can be fun to encounter. Doma Castle is Cyan's home. Players who are paying attention to the game can figure out that he needs to be there, and the resulting quest is a reward for knowing the game's lore. In essence, it's a kind of intuition puzzle. Another well-known example of allusion from Final Fantasy VI is the clock puzzle in Zozo. In this building, there's a clock which needs to be set to a certain time in order to open a secret door. Right before the player goes to Zozo, there's an NPC in Jador who says that everyone in Zozo lies. So when the player encounters a bunch of these lying NPCs who announce the time, the player should be able to put together that the answer to the clock puzzle is the only time those NPCs don't say. There are plenty of other great examples in other games. This NPC in Chrono Trigger mumbles about getting some jerky, but provides no clue as to where or when to get it. The answer is to stay in the same village, but to warp ahead in time. Zelda games are particularly rich in allusions. This NPC in Ocarina of Time remarks that he too hears the music coming through the boulders in Goron City. This is a signal to the player to use the newly acquired bombs to make a shortcut to the source of that music in Kokiri Forest. Likewise, this NPC in the back alleys of Hyrule Market tells the player that there's a fairy fountain somewhere on the path to Hyrule Castle, but he doesn't pinpoint where it is or how to access it. You can think of allusions as a great way to give the player instructions while still giving them a way to feel proud of themselves for doing a little extra detective work. Some players are totally fine with using walkthroughs, and doing so doesn't take the fun out of the game for them. But for everyone else, allusions are a great way to ensure that the player can earn their secrets with a little bit of in-universe help. Conditions are ironic statements about the interactive status of an affordance. Or, in simpler terms, a condition is when an NPC tells the player character that they can't do something or go somewhere until later. There are some important details which separate conditions from allusions or directions. In Final Fantasy VI, if the player flies to the village of Thamasa as soon as he or she acquires the airship, the owner of this shop will tell the player that he's not selling to strangers. End of story. This is a bit of conditioned dialogue. This shop is not fully interactive yet. If this were a direction or an allusion, the shop owner would say something like, "I won't sell to you unless you defeat the Slime King." That's a specific quest the player can take on right away, and is therefore a direction. But in this case, the shop owner just won't sell to the player until they return later in the game. The shop is off limits until then. Conditions are usually pretty clear about their absoluteness. This ship captain tells the player that the ship isn't going anywhere, and that's the end of the conversation. This merchant in Chrono Trigger won't sell armor until he gets the okay from the Queen, a character over whom the player has no control. And throughout Chrono Trigger, there are tons of sealed boxes and sealed doors, which NPCs say cannot possibly be opened. But why do conditions exist to begin with? Why not remove those ships, doors, and shops? The answer is, one of the most important pillars of RPG design is exploration. A good RPG spreads resources and information out across the entire world of the game, and rewards players who spend time to seek it all out. Conditions tell the player that they found something important, some part of the game that will become interactive, but they also tell the player that they'll have to come back to that object later. At their best, conditions are a great way to build up excitement for something that comes later in the game. These sealed boxes and sealed doors in Chrono Trigger are my favorite example of this. Not only do NPCs talk about them in more than one era, but when the player can finally open them, the payoff is absolutely enormous. Much of the game's best equipment can be found behind one of these seals. Let's switch over to narrative communication. In most games, the bulk of NPC communication is not ironic. Most of what NPCs have to say is simply about the world they live in, the people they know, or the stories they're going through.
Aye, that I do. Half all my life. We Battleborns have been here since the beginning, along with the Grey Maids.
These are what I call narrative NPC dialogues. They're not veiled messages from the designer about how to play the game. They're just another means for the writers to enrich the world and the story. In an elaboration, an NPC gives us more information about a person, place, thing, or event in the world of the game. These NPCs in Chrono Trigger give us some background on the war between Magus and Guardia. These NPCs in Final Fantasy VI give us some background about Kefka and Emperor Gestahl. There are lots of great individual examples of this. I could probably do an entire video about some of the greatest elaborations in RPGs, but the best way to understand them as a design feature is to look at them statistically. We can learn a lot about the underlying design philosophy of a game by looking at how the whole population of NPCs is distributed. Chrono Trigger has a relatively high number of elaborations about events. This makes sense as the game is about time travel. Without a large number of NPC descriptions of the events in each time period, it would be hard for first-time players to assemble the full timeline in their heads, or even remember why they're on a certain quest. Final Fantasy VII has a high number of elaborations about places. A large amount of these come in Midgar, which remains one of the most thoughtfully and lovingly crafted locations in any game ever. NPCs in Midgar give tons of extra details about what life is like there. The rest of the world contains a relatively large number of NPC elaborations about place as well. In one sense, this connects to the main theme of the game, which is all about people who have outlived the world that once defined them. But it also shows us one of the most important design goals of the game, which was to create fantastic and yet persuasive locations, something I think the designers did better in Final Fantasy VII than in any other entry in the series. The other kind of narrative NPC dialogue is what I call reactions. Rather than merely elaborating upon some noun in the game, this type of dialogue reinforces the player's agency by referring to events in which the player played a direct role. The most basic form of this is when an NPC notices something that the player did. But reactions can be varied, and they can tell us a lot about the games in which they appear. There are two kinds of reactions: attributive reactions and situational reactions. Attributive reactions are the more obvious kind. These happen when a player does something and an NPC attributes the result to the player characters. These can be big, and they can be small. But they nevertheless help to reinforce the amount of agency the player has in the world. Attributive reactions occur in all kinds of RPGs, but they're a lot more prevalent in open-world Western RPGs. The player character in an Elder Scrolls game can hardly walk down the street without NPCs going on about his or her accomplishments.
By Izmir, you've helped save the Gilded Green. Words can't express what that means to this city.
On the other hand, the NPCs in the second half of Final Fantasy VI mostly seem to be unaware that the player's party was directly involved with any of the catastrophic events or their resolution. They still talk about those events, but they tend to focus on how those events have affected their own lives. This is the other type of reaction dialogue, what I call a situational reaction. These NPCs still reinforce the player's agency since they talk about events the player had a role in, but they don't directly credit the player for doing anything. Looking at the balance of situational and attributive reactions can tell you a lot about the philosophy of a game. Elder Scrolls games constantly remind the player of their accomplishments because that's what those games are about. In an Elder Scrolls game, you are the hero chosen by destiny to determine the fate of the world.
Hey, you're the one they call the hero of Kvatch, aren't you? The one that closed the Oblivion Gate and saved the city?
In Final Fantasy VI, the player's party is supposed to be a little more like everyone else in the world. Like all the NPCs, every character in the party is trying to find their own reasons to live in the wake of an apocalyptic disaster. To look even a little more broadly, we can understand the nature of a game by looking at the balance of ironic and narrative dialogue in NPC populations as a whole. The Squaresoft classics are heavily skewed towards narrative dialogue, because their first concern is telling a compelling story. Zelda games, on the other hand, tend to skew more towards ironic dialogue, because there are so many secrets and side quests for the player to find. In Majora's Mask, for example, just over 55% of the dialogue had some ironic purpose. This is a huge discrepancy from the Final Fantasy games, which rarely have more than about 35% ironic dialogue. This video has focused on old games, but contemporary NPCs are as abundant and as important as ever. Certainly, The use of NPCs to embellish narrative games has seen some very impressive achievements in open-world games like Skyrim, GTA 5, and The Witcher. NPC irony, on the other hand, is a little more of a lost art. In a time when you can sit on your couch and read a walkthrough on your phone while you play a game, NPCs aren't as necessary as signposts as they used to be. But I think that NPC dialogue is a far more elegant way of guiding the player through the world of the game. Putting the instructions inside the game itself maintains the narrative illusion of the game and makes the world of the game feel more real. But it also lets the player feel clever for finding secrets without having to look at YouTube or a wiki. That's one place where today's games might learn a few things from the classics. The game design extracts are supported by Patreon. Patreon backers get bonus articles and bonus videos not available to the public. Right now, backers can get a bonus video about the systematic use of NPC dialogue in Skyrim. I'm also happy to announce that the books this channel is based on, the Reverse Design series, are now available in print. The print versions have been significantly revised, professionally edited, and they contain lots of new material never published anywhere else. Many thanks to my backers, including these kind folks. Thanks for watching.